thank you for supporting the Montana Book Festival. I'm sorry for the late start. And welcome to the Facing Change in a Harsh Land, Tales of the American West. And I'd like to welcome Dave Barrett, Kip Wessel, and Ryatt Eddie Cash, also known as Ethan H. Gaines. And they will have 10 to 15 minutes each to read and do a brief Q&A, and then at the end we'll open it up to discussion. And our first reader is Dave, who is the author of Gone, Alaska.
Yes, so Dave Barrett teaches writing at Missoula College. He's a graduate from the University of Montana MFA Writing program. So his novel, Gone, Alaska, was published by Adelaide Books in July 2019, so super recently. And it is a coming-of-age story set in the salmon fishing grounds of southeast Alaska, with issues and themes related to the American West and the natural environment. He has published stories in numerous journals, most recently in the Midwestern Gothic, Hobart, Quarter After 8, and Whiskey Island. So a round of applause for Dave. He's going to read some.
All right, everyone. Okay, well, thank you for being here on this beautiful day. I teach at Missoula College, and I canceled all my afternoon classes, so I told students they can come here for extra credit. I don't see any of them here. They must be playing hooky. All right, I would do the same. All right. Well, when I was first scheduled to do this, I was scheduled to read with the young adult novel, because my protagonist is an 18-year-old young man. So, but as you'll see as I start to read here, the content of my story is not your typical young adult kind of novel type stuff. It's a lot of kind of rough housing type things going on. But anyhow, I was very happy when Samantha Burris switched me to this venue. I thought it fit much better. All right, I'm going to read. I might read a little fast. I'm trying to get through some material. And then you guys, any questions? Feel free. All right, so my protagonist, Adam Porter, 18 years old, Philip Swanson, kind of a seasoned salmon fisherman. And then they invite these two people, Miss Sue Ann Bonnet and Old Judge Peterson, to visit during a kind of a little time off from fishing. And this is Philip Swanson. I have a feeling you'll get a kick out of these two, Swanson had informed me that afternoon during a lull out back. Old Judge Peterson's been here as long as any of these old scandies. Didn't come up from the old country, though. Came up from a little one-horse town of Jack Fork, Oklahoma. Or, excuse me, the little one-mule town of Jackass, Oklahoma, as Peterson puts it. Came up during the early 30s, was up in 36 when they set the all-time record salmon catch of 126 million fish. This was before technology, kid. Before depth gauges, CB radios, hydraulic power blocks. Hell yes, I'd give my left nut to be in on something like that. No closure dates, no regulatory commissions, no Indians whining about treaty rights, none of these enviro fascists from California telling us Alaskans what we can do with our fish. Just pure fishing, kid, pure fishing. And where you get a hold of Miss Sue Ann Bonnet, little crazy, but a real looker. That ain't her real name, Sue Ann Bonnet. That's the name Old Judge Peterson's son George gave her when they wed. Her father was some kind of chief, old crazy eyes something. Mother a Swedish whore. Claims she's some kind of a witch shaman something. Goes on and on about Mother Earth and Father Sky, about the end of the white man's world and new dawn of the Indians. That sort of shit. Real looker, though, and a good sport. Did a little dancing up in Dutch Harbor before her and George Peterson wed, if you know what I mean. All right. I guess I'll keep reading. All right. The halibut was rolled in a thick yellow dough that tasted like donut. The warm meat inside had a strange sweet flavor that was surprisingly not fishy. After 5 days of eating salmon smoked, baked, fried, and reheated as leftovers, the halibut tasted like the most marvelous dish in the world. I scraped my paper plate clean as I watched Miss Sue Ann Bonnet pour fresh brewed coffee into 3 styrofoam cups. Sue Ann handed a steaming cup to me. I was sitting on the floor next to the stove with my back braced against the baseboard of the Western World sleeping berth. "It's cowboy coffee," Sue Ann said, apologizing for the coffee grinds swirling around the top and clinging to the inside of the cup. "You're supposed to use the grinds like tobacco, see?" She tucked her tongue under the corner of her bottom lip so it looked like a plug of tobacco was underneath. "Worked my first summer on a purse seiner out of Ketchikan," Judge Peterson continued. "These here modern boats are luxury liners compared to what we worked on in those days. We had to haul our own anchor, chop our own wood for the stove, didn't have no hydraulic power blocks, bringing the nets right up to the boat. Had to haul the catch every inch of the way. Our hands would be so balled shut in the morning from gripping and pulling and twisting on them raw manila nets, we'd have to soak them in bowls of whiskey just to get them moving again. Then we'd chug a lug what was left in the bowls to make us dumb enough to go out and do it all over again. One of these fellows had a still hooked up to the stove, see?" Miss Sue Ann Bonnet was staring at me with a dark, thoughtful expression on her face. When I smiled at her, she did not smile back. I looked away, trying my best to concentrate on old Judge Peterson's words, the whiskey already taking effect. "Yes, sirree, Adam, my boy. We were an all-around different breed of man back then. Tougher, maybe. Not so much because we was born tougher, as we became tougher by just surviving the world we was living in then. Do you follow me, Adam?" I nodded, refilling my own cup this time. "We was coming out of the Depression then." When I motioned Sue Ann with the bottle for more whiskey, she again showed no sign of recognition, just this far away staring. Those of us who came up and lasted weren't necessarily looking to get rich. A little food in our bellies, some clothes on our backs, and we was happy as a lark. If there was anything left over, well, that was allotted to what you might refer to as the candy fund. He squeezed Sue Ann Bonnet's leg good-naturedly. Those of us who stuck around generally broke ties with our kin. We were sort of cut off up here, see? No phones, no jet planes. As for mail service then, he grunted and made a waving gesture with one of his big arms. Might as well stick your letter in a bottle. If any of the fellows received a Dear John letter, chances were he wouldn't find out about it till he'd plumb forgotten what that little farm gal that had him in such a whirl looked like in the first place. At this time, Swanson's crooked figure came clambering back down the 5-step ladder. He had that strange half-smile, half-grimace on his face. There was a Phillips screwdriver in his hand. "Sorry to cut in on the soapbox, old man," Swanson said, "but I need an extra pair of hands on a busted exhaust hose, and my new puller here is off duty." "At your service, Captain," Swanson bellowed, leaping off his upended bucket so fast I was amazed he hadn't cracked his head on the low ceiling. "That's all right, Judge," I said. "I'll help with the hose. You and Sue Ann, just relax." "No," Judge Peterson, holding me back with one of his giant hands. "Rest up, madam. It's good for an old dog to be of service." While Swanson and Judge Peterson fussed over the exhaust hose at the other end of the hull, Sue Ann and I watched. Some of the sparkle had returned to her eye, and I was still curious to know what she had been thinking about during Peterson's monologue. When she accepted my second offer of more whiskey, I noticed that alongside the diamond ring on her finger, she wore a thin gold band. It was one of those cheap promise rings I'd seen on a few girls back home in high school. I wondered why she still wore it. From my limited savvy on these matters, I'd always thought the woman took off the promise ring when she got the wedding band. "Why don't you two go up for some air?" Swanson suggested. "Better than sitting there like a couple of kids on a blind date." I helped Sue Ann clean up the paper plates, cups, and utensils. Then I followed her above deck. A big yellow moon was hanging over the cove as we came out on deck. Sue Ann made her way to the rear of the trawler, standing beside the galvanized pipes of the steel hay rack. I sat on the lidded picnic cooler and lit the joint I'd been carrying in the back pocket of my jeans since that morning. The joint was damp, and it took a few flicks from my lighter before I got it going okay. Sue Ann removed her bandana now, letting her raven-colored hair fall to the middle of her back. The midnight breeze coming off the open channel loosened and played with individual strands of her hair so they moved like thin electric shadows across the side of her face. She did not push them back from her face. She was staring towards the wooded shore. I noticed that same dark, melancholy look had returned to her eye, and seeing this made me shiver. I took one more toke, then passed it on to Sue Ann Bonnet. I became aware of the Western world slowly rotating on its anchor. Our deck lights had been turned off. Only a few trawlers anchored here still had any lights on. From a trawler in towards shore, I could hear the faint electric twang of a country western song. Outside of this, the only other sounds I heard were the plastic skiff bumping up against the rib of the Western world and Judge Peterson and Philip Swanson joking and cussing from the hull. "Listen," Miss Sue Ann Bonnet said in a hushed whisper, "along shore." Spooked from my reverie, I straightened on the cooler. Sue Ann had moved past the hay rack to the edge of the boat, one foot on the sluice railing and an arm around a steel cable. "Listen to what?" I said after a pause. I expected to hear a bear or deer breaking through the brush along shore, or maybe a pod of orcas blowing somewhere out on the channel. But I heard none of these sounds, just the same ones from before. "Shh," Sue Ann answered, still leaning over the side of the boat. "The trees, Adam. You can hear them crying." Looking toward shore, I could just discern the subtle swaying of the great trunks in the blue light. "Yeah," I said, holding in a long toke. "I hear the trees creak. Their creaking sounds nice." "No, Adam," Sue Ann said, the urgency in her voice making me cough a little as smoke escaped my lungs. "Listen with your heart, not your ears. Listen closer." I stared down into the black-green waters, and for a moment, the sound of the great trunks swaying did sound more like crying than creaking. "Wow," I heard myself saying in the same hushed whisper. "I hear it now, a second sound, like people murmuring and crying softly at a funeral." I looked in towards the yellow light overflowing into the wheelhouse from the hull. Judge Peterson and Swanson's cursing and banging away on things rose up from the engine room as before, and I was struck how they were part of a very different world than the one Miss Sue Ann Bonnet and me were experiencing here on deck, if only for a moment. "Wild stuff," I said, passing the joint to Sue Ann again. "Kind of spooky, but if all living things have feeling and a tree is a living thing, I suppose it has as much right to cry as the rest of us." Now Sue Ann was crying and laughing at the same time. She took a long hit, so the end of the joint lit up cherry red. "You all right?" I said. I made to get up, go to her, but remained seated when Sue Ann motioned me to remain so. "Yes," she said, laughing again. She wiped her nose with the back of her hand. "It's this goddamn dope. That, and you remind me of someone I knew a long time ago." I began to ask her who this was, but stopped when she shook her head to signify the subject was off limits. She sat beside me on the cooler. "Thank you," Sue Ann said, taking hold of my hand. "I feel better now." I could feel the warmth of her body next to mine, and feeling this made me shiver. When she turned towards me, her eyes were still soft and wet from crying. She looked into my eyes and I into hers, and for an instant, I was sure we were going to kiss. Then, just when I thought she really would kiss me, she looked away, breaking out in a loud but warm laugh that made me laugh unknowingly along with her. "Oh, Adam." When her laughter died down to a few snorting chuckles, she threw an arm over my shoulder and kissed me on the cheek. "You're a beautiful young man," she said, mussing with my hair a little now. "Christ, if I was a young woman again, I wouldn't let you out of my sight for a minute." I smiled. Then she said something that made me stop smiling. "Adam, get out of this place." Just like that, point blank. "What?" "This place," she repeated, throwing her hands up and looking around us. "I know how wonderful and beautiful all this is, but truth is we are killing the thing we all love by fishing it so hard it can't sustain itself. I've seen so many boats on Bristol Bay the night before a sockeye run that it's lit up like a floating city. We take every salmon we can get, and then we wonder why each year the fish counts get lower. The Canucks blame it on the Americans blame it on the Canucks, and everyone blames it on the tribes. But we are all to blame. No one is willing to step back and give Mother Earth a chance to heal herself. We take and take and take." She paused to finish tying her bandana around her hair again, and then continued, "When I was just a little older than you, Adam, they sent me to a rehabilitation center. They made me read this novel by this funny Russian author whose name I can't remember or even pronounce. Dostoevsky or Dogwesky." "Dostoevsky?" I asked. "That's it," Miss Sue Ann said, her large brown eyes lighting up when she smiled. "I knew you were a smart kid, Adam, though I still can't pronounce the damn name right." I smiled back, laughing a little at Sue Ann calling the great Russian writer Dogweski. That was pretty funny. Anyhow, Sue Ann continued, serious again, her eyes scolding me. I remembered this line from the book. It said, the hardest thing for a person to do is take a new step, a truly new step. And that damn Rusky is right, because we're all such creatures of habit. She coughed lightly, covering her mouth with a fist. She paused, a look on her face like she had suddenly seen something she remembered, maybe a ghost from her past, and then, just as suddenly, it was gone again. She shook her head and continued, but I did it, Adam. I changed my wild and wanton ways. It was the hardest thing I ever did, but I did it, and if I hadn't, I'd never have met a truly great guy like my husband, George. Taking this step is hard as hell, Mr. Adam Porter, but it can be done. Take it from me, a gal who knows. The breeze coming in from the open channel was stronger now, and the crying from the trees along shore louder than ever. Adam, Sue Ann said, sitting up straight on the cooler, can you promise me one thing? Sure, I said. Promise you'll consider what I'm telling you tonight. I know it's not as simple as I'm making it. We all have bills to pay, roofs to keep, kids to feed, but there has to be a better way. We've got to put Mother Earth first, give her time to heal so there'll be something left for future generations. Alaska is not a whore, Adam. It's not something to hump and dump on. We've got all the gold diggers we need. If this is why you're here, then go back, Adam Porter. Go back to where it is you come from and see if you can't heal the place you're from. Take that step, be that change, promise. Suddenly from the wheelhouse came the stumbling, thudding sound of old Judge Peterson and Philip Swanson tramping up from below. As they emerged through the wheelhouse door, Judge Peterson was leaning on Swanson with the finished fifth of Jack Daniels dangling from the crook of one finger. At the top of their lungs, the duo was singing, rye whiskey, rye whiskey, rye whiskey, I cry. If you don't give me rye whiskey, I'll lay down and die. Stopping mid-verse when Judge Peterson saw me and Sue Ann sitting side to side on the cooler. Well, 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 Judge Peterson bellowed, aren't you two a cozy pair? We sprang to our feet. It's not what you think, I began to explain, but never got to finish as the old man's body suddenly went limp. Sue Ann and I came quickly to Swanson's assistance. Peterson had passed out in Swanson's arms, just like that. I grabbed him by the legs while Sue Ann and Swanson got hold of his arms. We lugged his 250-plus frame to the skiff. There we loaded him in much the same manner he'd been unloaded. You gonna be all right on the road back to the Mighty Mert? Swanson asked, once Miss Sue Ann Bonnet had found her position at the oars. She had to sit herself down between Peterson's stilt-like legs, using his armpits as footlocks for her boots. As they shoved off the western world with an oar, Swanson called out, hope George don't get no ideas about you two rowing off in the moonlight like this. Don't get my hopes up, Sue Ann called back. Swanson and I watched as the skiff waddled farther and farther away until the only way we knew the skiff was still out there was by the sound of oars still slapping the water. I thought it strange how Miss Sue Ann Bonnet hadn't said goodbye to me, hadn't even looked at me since Swanson and Peterson appeared. What were you two up to back here? Swanson said, jabbing me in the ribs with a stiff finger. I don't know, I said. I thought about telling him about the trees and then thought better of it. She mentioned something about me reminding her of someone she knew a long time ago. Swanson said, that's probably it. You probably might remind her of a fella she knew when she was a young girl. Engaged to the guy, I think, Indian, like her old man, Klingit. Grew up on the res together. Anyway, this fellow went out on a crab boat one summer, never came back. First time out. Judge Peterson said she went a little ding-dong after that, got messed up in all that 60s hippie shit, then on to Dutch Harbor where she worked as a stripper for a few years until George came along and made an honest woman out of her. George treats her real nice, but I guess she still trips out from time to time. Of course, Swanson added, stiff-fingering me in the ribs again, I've never been with Miss Sue Ann Bonnet when she was tripping. All right. So that, am I over 15 probably?
Yeah. I think we'll just do the next two.
Okay, just do the next two. And then we do questions at the end. That'd be great. Great. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much. Okay, wonderful. So our next author is Kip Wessel, and his debut novel is First You Swallow the Moon, which won the Book Life Prize in Fiction and the Writer's Digest Book Award. He earned a fiction fellowship and an MFA from the University of Montana, and his short fiction has been published in a dozen commercial and literary publications, including Southern Humanities Review, Cut Bank, and Big Sky Journal. And he's taught fiction writing at the University of Montana and the Loft Literary Center.
It's very strange to be here. I live in Minnesota, and I lived here for a period of about 3 years. I was just thinking about today. I was walking around the campus, I was walking around the town. I think it was 30 years ago exactly that I moved here. There's this thing.
Too much.
Testing, 1, 2, 3. No, that's good. I'll just try to project. Just of sense memory, you know, you tap into and you kind of forget about. You come back to a place that smells the way it did back then or whatever. And so walking around today was very evocative of a bunch of emotions. But this novel is about actually that time in a lot of ways, and it's about a young man who loses a brother. He kind of spirals into a depression, moves to Montana because he becomes obsessed with grizzly bears and wants to figure out a way to replicate the grizzly bear's hibernation technique so that he can kind of make it through his depression. And the relationship that he's in with this young woman at the time for a long period of time starts to unravel, and that's where this kind of picks up. Claire was anxious about an invitation one of her professors extended her, a small dinner party at the professor's house with several of the same individuals I had met at Freddie's Feed and Read days earlier. I won't have a thing in common to discuss with a group of people from the geography program, I told her. You'd be better off without me there. It's only dinner, she said. Please say you'll go. There'll be other non-students there, significant others. When we moved through the entryway of Dr. Bashiri's house, a scattering of Claire's classmates were sitting on the living room floor, their legs crossed. Molly, Paul, his wife Lauren, Keith. Zither music played through the stereo speakers, and we handed Dr. Bashiri a bottle of $10 Cabernet. We chatted readings with the others, and Claire's professor hauled our coats off to a side room. I felt a trace of perspiration prick my forehead. I wondered how long this dinner event would last and if I'd have anything to add to the conversation. Sitting in a half circle around the living room didn't promote a whole lot of breathing room. Dr. Bashiri poured us neat glasses of Aragi Sagi, a strong Iranian vodka that burned a flowered flame into your chest at first swallow, and we each smiled mutely at one another after downing them in short order. For a moment, I wondered whether I was an asset or deficit in Claire's place in this company, and I found myself wishing for a side door or window I could slip my way through unnoticed. "You're the bear guy," Paul said, and smiled. His wife Lauren tapped him lightly on the knee. "Sorry," I asked. "Aren't you the one that drove all the way out here to count bears in the woods?" I nodded and calculated imagined steps to the door. "It's an important research project in the Scapegoat Wilderness Corridor," said Molly. "Oh, no, I didn't mean..." "It's totally cool," continued Molly. "I'm completely envious not to be a part of it." I glanced quickly at Claire. Her face was flushed. "Oh, yeah," said Paul. "Did I make that sound silly or something?" "You didn't," I said. Dr. Bashiri smiled from the corner of the room. "We should all be so lucky to move through the woods counting bears," he said. "Maybe we could make that our post-dinner activity," said Keith. And here I was, feeling thankful for a possible close to the topic. "How many bears on South Higgins would you project?" he asked. Is there a bear abacus you guys use, little rounded ears on each of the wooden pegs? I nodded, silent. Only my second time in his company, it was becoming trickier not to assume this guy held some identified grudge against me, or the study, or maybe I was reading it wrong. I absolutely meant no, Paul interjected. None taken, I said. Forget it. And yes, I am the guy that drove all the way out here to count bears in the woods. And we're all glad you did, said Lauren. Otherwise we wouldn't have Claire here. Dr. Bashiri poured a new round of aragi sagi, and we lifted our shot glasses and drank a silent toast. It's good welcoming you all into my home, he said. He ushered me, Claire and me, through a quick tour of a small house, the remaining guests presumably already having had the privilege, and if they didn't, I didn't care. The reprieve from Keith, at least, was welcome. Bashiri took time showing us his study, walked us past framed photographs of his family, his parents and brothers and a sister, a photo of his wife, since deceased, dark eyes and a gentle smile. How'd she die, I asked. Ovarian cancer, he said, 12 years now, very sad, very sad. We walked upstairs past a colorful tapestry hung on the wall and two-story bedroom with dormer windows where a large porcupine scuttled across the floor of an 8-foot wire cage, a few tree branches strewn across. This I hadn't counted on. An Iranian geography professor in the middle of Montana with a live porcupine thundering across his half-story alcove. Did I tell you about Dr. Bashiri's porcupine? Asked Claire. It's a detail I would have remembered, I answered. I found him struggling on a wooden trail 2 springs ago, said the professor. I think he had fallen out of a tree. Again with the tree-falling mammals, first Christoph's bear cub and now this caged porcupine. Could none of the tree-climbing mammals of Montana maintain the dexterity necessary to remain adequately treed? I mean, why go up there in the first place? I thought only drunk humans and koala fell out of trees, said Claire. It's quite common, said Dr. Bashiri. Something like 40% of porcupine skeletons in museums are said to have fractures, most likely sustained from tree falls. And that's not from museum directors shaking the trees until they fall out, I asked. I pictured a woodland floor, an assemblage of disheveled porcupines, bears, squirrels, martens, and raccoons, all liberated from the skyward limbs of trees, cartoon stars swimming their heads. This one was freshly fallen, continued Bashiri, stunned and injured. I took him home, fed him, watched over him, gave him a warm bed. Now he walks again, only crooked. Claire smiled. He's very handsome. If you ever need a porcupine sitter, she said, and gestured to the two of us. We returned to the living room and joined the semicircle on the professor's wide carpet. Dr. Bashiri brought us cups of yogurt mixed with chopped shallots and a small salad of diced cucumber, tomato, parsley, and onion, mixed in an olive oil, lemon juice, and black pepper dressing. When we finished, he whisked the bowls and salad plates away and brought us steaming plates of fried eggplants, simmered in tomato sauce, yellow peas, and onions over basmati rice. The entire house smelled of sweet spices and steamed vegetables. I managed to sequester the bottle of Cabernet we had brought, planted it directly behind us, and continued to pour myself glasses in between conversation on tourism's impact on sustainable development, sidetracked discussions of Helena politics. I nodded and smiled. I nursed the wine until the bottle was empty. I leaned into Claire's ear. There's a porcupine above our heads, I whispered. She smiled and laughed lightly. I know, dear, she said, and patted my leg. A barbed rodent is scurrying right now, right here above our heads in these thin joists, I whispered. So show us this trick of yours, said Keith. He gestured at me with his fingers wrapped around a bottle of Michelob. This thing you do with your heart. Keith, said Claire. His heart? Asked Paul. If it's not topical, said Keith. I merely thought a demonstration would. What's wrong with his heart? Asked Paul. I felt the tiniest hairs across the back of my neck. He can slow it to the pace of a hibernating bear's, answered Keith. Right? He beamed. Keith, said Claire, this isn't the place. No, I answered, it's fine. It's a fine place for parlor games and the like. I glanced at Dr. Bashiri and noticed a trace of puzzlement. I felt betrayed. Claire had shared something I hadn't exposed to anyone but her. In particular, she apparently shared it with this guy, Keith. I wondered the context. What else had she told him about me, about us? Why? My face was flushed with what I only imagined was a dark hue of crimson. When I focused back on the dinner guests circled around the living room, I realized the entire party was momentarily mute. They looked in my direction. How about if you give me 5 minutes to relieve myself, I said, and I'll come right back and Houdini you my torpor heart trick. Awesome, said Keith, and I climbed the stairs toward Dr. Bashiri's second-floor bathroom. I splashed water on my face, stared at my reflection in the mirror. The low mumble of post-dinner conversation was audible from the stairwell, and I had less desire than ever to return to the gathering, despite the hospitality of Claire's professor. Instead, I walked into the porcupine's room and sat. I fantasized an escape. Images of Steve McQueen bouncing his motorbike over bumpy barbed wire fields, the rear tires spitting gravel, and a fuck you all spire. I wondered if Claire wouldn't come find me and maybe explain why she had divulged my greatest secret with this guy Keith, what motivated that disclosure, and whether she'd apologize or calm my nerves or otherwise show at least she was on my side. I don't know why it took me until that single awkward moment to consider the question. Were we still on each other's sides? Was I on hers? Was she on mine? Weren't we supposed to, at the very least, be on the same side? What or whom were we permitting between? The more minutes that passed, and it took her at least 15 to climb the stairs and find me, the more hopeless and astonished and lost I began to feel. Rapidly accumulated worry and wonder. What are you doing? Claire asked, her voice as hushed as she could manage under the circumstances. She spotted an open cage door and my crouch in the far corner of the alcove, pillowcase taut between my hands, no porcupine in sight. Close the door, I ordered, and Claire responded on reflex. What in the hell? She asked. He ran into the closet. Claire stared at me. Her eyes were swollen moons. I'm giving him 5 minutes to calm down, I said. When did he get out? How did he get out of his cage in the first place? She asked. And what are you doing with that pillowcase? Claire, I watched this guy a good 10 minutes. He's not walking a crooked pattern, no more than the rest of us. Will you answer me? There's nothing wrong with this porcupine. He ought to be back out in the woods, doing porcupine stuff. You can't kidnap Dr. Bashiri's porcupine, she whispered, her face red. It's not kidnapping, technically, I said. Technically? Jesus, Jack. I was thinking we could slip him out, unnoticed, unchecked, and get him over to Christoph for a second opinion, on the walking pattern, I mean. Christoph's probably seen 1,000 of these in the woods. A second opinion. I could do it right now, I said. I could bring him back before the party is even over. Oh, that's a great idea, said Claire. I'll just tell everyone my boyfriend needs to step out a moment with a bowling ball-shaped, quill-riddled pillowcase. There's got to be a side exit somewhere. There almost always is. Wait, no, Jack, the porcupine just can't not be here the next time he comes up the stairs. Don't you think that's something a person would notice? Okay, he said, there may be a few wrinkles I need to iron out first. Wrinkles? Well, come on, I said. I'm really not interested in heading back down those stairs just to show that whole room of people I barely know my heart experiment, like it was some frat party gimmick. I mean, what in the hell? You don't have to, she said. We can just forget that even happened. Forget it. I mean, really, Claire, you told people about that. Does everyone know about it? Well, obviously now, she said. Before now, I mean. Don't do this, she said. Don't turn this around and make it my fault. Well, it's related. I mean, if we hadn't just had that scene downstairs, I really don't think we'd be standing in this room right now whispering about a goddamn porcupine abduction scheme right now. A clawed scurry from the closet broke her concentration. Oh my God, hissed Claire. Let's get him out of there, I said. Don't get too close to the tail. The tail? They use it to launch their quills. We're lucky I've read up on this one. Claire glared at me from across the room. I'm getting Dr. Bashiri, she said. Wait, Claire. Well, tell him you got curious and accidentally let his porcupine out. And that's not fishy? Just give me some time to get him back into his cage. I can do this, really. Claire folded her arms. I'll get him back in his cage, I said, but I'm not climbing back down those stairs to show your friend Keith and everyone else circle around that living room how I can turn my heart inside out. Claire nodded. I'd rather just stay up here in this cage with this porcupine than have to do that ever. Claire drew her shoulders back and then released a quiet but lengthy sigh. She told me she was going back to head down to the party before others investigated. She told me she was relying on me to do the right thing. But I'm only waiting 5 minutes for you to do that, she said, the right thing. It wasn't, I suppose, the moment of solidarity I had hoped for and needed, but I wasn't willing to acknowledge how my own action, the porcupine liberation shenanigans, distracted the opportunity, hampered the desired outcome in the first place. I only focused in that moment on the separation I felt from Claire, from that gathering, from the universe short of the woods. And then, just like every other human tragedy that gulps its first breath as misguided inspiration and swiftly evolves into disaster through the seemingly benign sequential order of one step marrying another and then the next, I soon found myself on the other side of Dr. Bashiri's alcove window and then down the drain pipe to the first-story roof line, and then momentarily paused on the cold shingles of his back veranda before I knifed into the spired sea of juniper and yelped at the sharp pain that felt as though a Bowie knife had sheared all the superior, inferior, flexor, and extensor ligaments, muscles, and tendons, formally cementing my ankle in place. In hindsight, it probably wasn't the height that held the primary responsibility for the injury as much as the 24 pounds of wriggling porcupine. Emulating the animal's own noted anomaly of mobility, it was now the human who initiated an angled walk across the dark lawn. I attempted to both cradle the pillowcase containing the bald animal and keep him clear of my own body, hoping at this point to steer clear of any additional damage to either one of us. Then I saw crossing cones of flashlight approaching, the footsteps behind them, wet punches into the sod. For a moment, they seemed welcoming, the two oval beams of light. In between the throb of ankle pain, I imagined them two beautiful moons. Maybe this is how the night sky appears through the eyes of a bear, the moon inhaled, like standing in a sea-foam tide, the galactic surge of starry water, the dewed smell of the moon's salt. The flashlight orbs grew brighter, and I held perfectly still. The porcupine clicked its teeth. A pungent odor wafted through the pillowcase, and I pictured the two of us, man and porcupine, living out our remaining days in the clipped shadows of trees of the scapegoat. I would pare the inner bark of fir trees, skin tufts of cellulose, and help him out with the more difficult tasks of porcupine diet in a gesture of friendship and love. For a moment, a brief moment, I honestly believed or simply hoped my future, both our futures, would become that easy. Instead, there was only the cadence of my own breathing. I closed my eyes and waited for my heart to slow. It came easily, on reflex. I drew deep breaths, felt nothing but the soft chant of blood, a withered river, the gentle drumming in my ears, a receding wave farther and farther out to sea. I pressed my fingers against the flesh beneath my jaw and felt the weakening oscillation until single elongated pulses separated an expanding breath of time, until I could no longer feel a single thing, and then my body drifted over the impossible river beneath me, up into the chalk of sky where my eyes adjusted with the nocturne vision of bears, the whole tangle of stars wrapped around my head, my fingers opened toward them. I was 1,000 miles above the curve of woods and water, 1,000 miles above the 6 individuals who collectively cradled the unharmed but seriously pissed off and pillowcased porcupine, and then checked the pulse of the shallow breath of the supine man on the dark sod who moments before sat across from them on the living room floor. As I slowly, assuredly drifted back to earth, my heart flooded in wonder about how much longer Claire could possibly continue to love me.
Thanks so much. Okay, now we're going to welcome our final reader for the day. So Ethan H. Gaines, who goes by Ryatt Eddie Cash, is an entrepreneur and publisher. Ethan H. Gaines. Okay, so the name derived from 3 separate individuals that brought a sort of meaning to the writer. Gaines is the co-owner and publisher at Last Best Press, an independent publishing company focusing on fiction writers of Montana. Cash is the author of Marston series, Apache Pass, and Sagebrush Kid, while Gaines is ready to release his debut, his historical novel Tears of the Saint in October. Okay, a big round of applause.
So I'm not sure how I'm going to be able to follow those two gentlemen up, but I'm going to try my best. The part I'm going to read is from the second book, Sagebrush Kid. The first book kind of followed the character Colton Marston from Southern California into Arizona in 1861. And during that time, before the Civil War started, there was a little-known incident called the Bascom Affair, and it kind of kicked off the Apache Wars, and he found himself in the middle of that, and he lost some people he loved. And so the second book kind of follows him going up north into Colorado, where he's helping start a little cattle ranch. But then old loyalties bring him up into Montana, which at the time was Idaho territory. And this is during, I want to say 1864, just after the vigilante started. But this part is when he comes back to Colorado. At the end of May, the K-Bar Ranch came out with a good seed for the next year. Kelly sold most of his cattle for sale to the Army forts on the north end of the Bozeman Trail. Some he sold to the eateries in both Virginia City and Bannock. Colton Marston rode out of Alder Gulch bound for Salt Lake City with around $50. His original plan was to resupply at Fort Hall, but he found it had been washed out and the volunteer soldiers were rebuilding Fort Hall at Spring Creek, north of the original fort. At a campfire, Colton shared coffee and gave some of his grub to make a meal. As they were eating and drinking scalding coffee, the soldiers were talking about Indian trouble in Colorado. Yeah, with the Snake Indians causing a ruckus in the Cheyenne and Arapaho bands in Colorado, we'll have an all-out war, one was saying. What's that? Colton asked, perking his head up. Black Kettle can't control his braves raiding and killing. Those young bucks attack any white man they can find. Black Kettle was a big name among the Cheyenne. Colton was instantly worried. When dawn came, Colton was in the saddle riding as fast as the Morgan could take him. He rode through rain when he could and could only sleep restlessly. The Lawrence Ranch, being isolated from neighbors and anyone who might help, worried him. Near the end of June, he rode into Fremont Pass and camped along the river that ran alongside the Lawrence Ranch. He sat next to the fire, Henry rifle lying next to him. Anxiety gripped his chest and knotted his stomach. He could scarcely breathe, thinking of what might have happened. Morning dawned and Colton stomped his boots on. The Morgan sensed his urgency and rode with determination. The cabin was outlined against the trees and sky, the water ran calmly next to him, and all seemed good. Colton just couldn't tell if he could see smoke from the cabin's chimney. He stopped the Morgan when he saw the cabin, burned but still standing. They had made it well. Colton put the Morgan at a walk and saw two figures lying in the ranch yard. They were mutilated beyond identification, but Colton knew it was Fernando and Edward. They had been there for some time. Colton stepped down from the saddle and drew out the Henry. He cocked the hammer back, having levered a shell into the chamber the night before. Edward's carbine lay off to the side, and Fernando, what he guessed was Fernando, only had his fighting knife. "Christina!" Colton shouted, knowing full well no one was around. He looked wildly around but found nobody. The cabin door was open, so Colton entered. His sense of smell was overcome by the stench of a rotting corpse. There was Christina, mutilated as well, lying on the dirt floor of the cabin. Next to her was a shotgun, broke open as though to receive new shells, with the two replacement shells lying next to it. Images of Consuelo flashed through his mind and his knees buckled. Colton hit the ground on his knees, using the rifle to support himself. Tears fell from his eyes unbarred. To hell with his foolish pride. Why did he have to go? He should have married Christina and settled here. He might not have been able to turn the tide of the battle, but he would have died beside her. That was all he wanted. Poe. Jason's body was not among them, so where was he? Colton took the time to bury all three in the shade of the trees before getting back into the saddle to look for signs of Poe. All the cattle had been driven off the land, and he wasn't at his old stead or the line cabin that took some time for Colton to find. He returned to the gravesite and sat down next to where he buried Christina. When he first rode up, he had felt numb. It was almost as if he was in denial, but now he was not, and he wept over her grave. The Colt was heavy in his hand as he drew it from his holster. He cocked the action back, tears running down his cheeks. Colton pressed the bore of the pistol to his temple and took three deep breaths in before squeezing the trigger. It fell with an uneventful click. Shaken, he checked the pistol and saw the copper nipple that ignited the gunpowder was gone. He sat in disbelief for some time. The gunfighter gathered himself and found a large piece of wood. With his knife, he carved out a message. To whomever comes here, here lies good people who wanted a good life. Please treat this country in the same manner.